Welcome to This Explainer. What if I told you the foundational story you've been taught about the Bible, the whole unpayable debt and cosmic ledger thing, is actually completely backwards? Right? Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating paper that totally deconstructs that narrative. If you've ever read these ancient texts and thought, hold on, this doesn't really match the summaries I've been handed, well, buckle up. We're going to dive into a super compelling academic argument that reconstructs the true theological framework right out of the ancient text itself. Let's just jump right in and contrast these two frameworks. On one hand, you've got the inherited story. This is the one most of us know. It's all about moral ledgers, a perfectly just deity who literally can't even look at sin, and this whole system of penal substitution where somebody has got to pay the debt. But completely contrasting that, we find what this research identifies as the actual governing story, and it's been hiding right in plain sight. If you just read the narrative straight through from Genesis on, the real plot centers on two entirely different ideas: God's ultimate desire for shared presence, which we call dwelling, and the human requirement of allegiance. There is this single observation from the source that just totally exposes the cracks in that inherited story. The paper points out that the supposed central tension of the whole Bible, this big conflict within God between his strict justice and his mercy, is remarkably absent from the actual lives of Old Testament characters. I mean, think about it. Abraham, Moses, David, literally none of them are agonizing over how a righteous God could possibly forgive them. It just doesn't come up. And honestly, if the main tension of a story is practically invisible to everyone living inside 2/3 of that story, we really have to ask ourselves if it's the central tension at all.
So, rethinking holiness and debt. To understand this paradigm shift, we first need to deconstruct the load-bearing walls of that familiar, inherited story.
And it all really starts with this massive misunderstanding of the word holy. Over centuries of tradition, we've basically equated holy with flawless moral perfection, which leads to this idea that a holy God has to physically recoil from sin. But in the original Hebrew, holiness meant sacredness. It meant being set apart or dedicated. Its opposite isn't sinful, which is a huge surprise for a lot of people. The actual antonym is common or profane. As the text shows us, the biblical God frequently and very willingly draws near to flawed, sinful humans without recoiling at all. His purity absolutely does not forbid his nearness. Which brings us to this radical rethinking of debt. The research challenges the whole philosophical idea that a just God is somehow constitutionally forced to extract payment for sin, like he's managing some sort of cosmic accounting ledger. Instead, the text shows God freely canceling debts over and over again. He forgives people exactly like a generous sovereign extending a royal pardon. Just as a human king can freely forgive an offense without demanding a check in the mail, the biblical God is completely free to forgive without needing a transactional payment.
Moving on to the quest for presence. If the story isn't about settling a cosmic debt with an offended accountant, what on earth is it about? Well, this points us to the first true pillar of the narrative. Think about Eden like this. The original design wasn't just a pleasant park with some fruit trees. It was a shared, overlapping space. It was the exact meeting point where the heavenly and human families actually dwelled together in God's presence. And the mandate for humanity was to take that sacred space and expand it, literally push the boundaries of the garden outward until the entire planet became the dwelling place of God. This right here establishes the baseline for the whole biblical plot. The goal from page 1 is shared presence. Now, when you contrast these two views, it's a real game changer for how we understand Old Testament sacrifices. Under the traditional penal substitution view, killing an animal was all about transferring moral guilt and absorbing a penalty, right? But the presence view argues something radically different. The sacrificial blood was actually applied to the sanctuary itself, not the worshiper. It was basically a cosmic cleaning system, a system of purification to wipe away the ritual impurity of daily life. And why? So that a holy God could maintain his dwelling among an impure people. The entire focus was on keeping access to God's presence open, not discharging a moral guilt ledger.
Okay, faith as covenant allegiance. If the first pillar is the quest for presence, we really need to understand the second pillar, which is all about the requirement of loyalty. Notice the kinds of questions the narrative actually asks its characters. The determining question is almost never, has your penalty been paid? It's almost always, to which God do you belong? And this completely redefines our modern understanding of faith. In the ancient context, faith wasn't just checking boxes on a list of intellectual beliefs. The word actually shares a root with fidelity, so faith was fundamentally
about exclusive covenant loyalty. It meant steadfast reliability to one rightful Lord, which means salvation itself needs a redefinition here. It's not God balancing an accounting ledger by transferring some moral surplus into your spiritual bank account. Actually, scratch that. It's more like God's open, public recognition of a person's restored allegiance. Salvation is the literal transfer of your loyalty away from rival powers and bringing it back to the rightful Creator.
And to really grasp why that loyalty matters so much, we have to talk about the reality of rival spiritual powers in the ancient biblical world. The text absolutely does not treat the gods of the surrounding nations as just imaginary blocks of wood. It treats them as real spiritual intelligences, beings who rebelled, abused the earthly authority they were entrusted with, and actively demanded human worship. Because of this dynamic, idolatry wasn't just, a bad habit. It was literal treason against the rightful king. All right, let's look at the cross as victory. How exactly does the central event of the New Testament fit into this newly reconstructed framework?
The paper argues that the cross actually functions beautifully along two converging lines that the whole narrative has been building toward. First, perfectly echoing those Old Testament sacrifices, it acts as the definitive, final act of purification that permanently cleanses people, giving them full access to the sacred presence. And second, it's the decisive victory. Jesus refusing to bow to the rival powers, his exorcisms, and ultimately his resurrection, it all culminates in the total defeat and expulsion of those usurping spiritual powers. Now here is a truly striking observation from the source. If we treat the cross as a transactional payoff, like a blood payment required just to appease the anger of an offended deity, we're actually mirroring the pagan theology of the rival powers. The ancient pagan world believed their gods constantly needed to be bought off or compensated with blood. The profound irony is that interpreting the cross as an appeasement transaction means we're reading the biblical story through the lens of the exact same rival powers the gospel is meant to overthrow. The actual biblical covenant is all about purifying a people for access, not paying off an angry God. So, the reunited family. Having established these new load-bearing walls, let's take a rapid-fire sprint through the entire biblical timeline to see how this paradigm fits the plot.
When you map the grand narrative from Genesis to Revelation, the themes of rupture and reclamation follow this presence and allegiance framework flawlessly. It kicks off with creation, right? Two families, heavenly and human, dwelling together in the garden. Then the rupture happens. Humanity is exiled from the presence, and the nations divide their loyalties among rival gods. The climax is the cross, bringing that final purification for access and dealing a death blow to those rival powers. And finally, the consummation, where heaven and earth are completely reunited. The whole storyline just clicks into place, without ever needing to cram in outside philosophical structures about ledgers and unpayable debts.
And when you look closely at that consummation, the story concludes exactly as it was originally intended to expand. The distance between heaven and earth is completely abolished. Every single curse from the initial rupture is reversed. You have a reunited family, human and heavenly, dwelling together in a renewed world. And honestly, the most fascinating part of the whole shebang, redeemed humanity is elevated to take up the governing roles over creation that the rebels' spiritual powers forfeited.
As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a massive, fascinating question to ponder. If an entire framework of debt and penalty could be artificially layered over a story that was originally about presence and allegiance, what other inherited lenses are blinding us to the true paths our oldest stories are actually traveling? Next time you read a foundational text, ask yourself, are you actually reading the text or are you just reading the tradition?